Morning in Pine Ridge broke with a biting, dry, cold remnants of an unrelenting winter, lingering as patches of old snow by the edge of the runway. At Gate 14, passengers lined up quietly and in order, dragging their suitcases and holding paper tickets in hand. Flight Pacific Horizon 30 Jean 19 was preparing for departure, destination Atlanta. At the end of the line, hardly anyone noticed the woman walking at a slow and steady pace. She wore a dark charcoal gray coat and carried a worn brown leather bag that had accompanied her for decades. She wasn't in a hurry, nor was she glued to a phone like everyone else around her. Her calm and sharp eyes slowly looked up at the flight information board. Her name was Judge Miriam Cross, age 63, a federal judge from the Eastern District of Virginia. She had just delivered the keynote address at a regional judicial conference titled Justice in Times of Division and was now on her way home, back to her quiet apartment in northern Atlanta. No cameras, no speeches, no applause, only the silence she had always considered a companion. Her outfit was simple: a turtleneck sweater, dark trousers, flat shoes, no pearls, no high heels. Her silver hair was neatly tied back in a bun, and her reading glasses sat low on her nose. With that appearance, anyone passing by might have mistaken her for a retired librarian or a grandmother on her way to visit her grandkids. The priority boarding call came from the agent at the gate. Miriam stepped forward and handed over her paper ticket. Seat 2A, first class. The attendant smiled and waved her through. She nodded slightly and boarded the plane. First class was small and quiet, with blue leather seats, polished chestnut wood accents, and warm overhead lighting. Miriam found her window seat and tucked her bag beneath the seat in front of her. She pulled out an old novel and folded her coat neatly across her lap. She didn't look around, didn't make conversation. She opened her book to the page marked by an old receipt and began to read. It was The Known World, a novel she had once quoted in a ruling involving land rights for African American families in rural Kentucky. Gradually, first class began to fill up. A white man in a blue blazer entered and took the aisle seat next to her. He glanced briefly at her, then returned his gaze to his phone screen. Miriam seemed unbothered, or if she was, she didn't show it. The sharp clack of high heels echoed from the front of the cabin. A tall woman with blonde hair tied up neatly and holding a clipboard appeared. Her name tag read, Rachel Whitman. Rachel walked down the aisle, scanning the passenger list. When she reached row 2, she stopped. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, polite but stiff. "May I see your ticket?" Miriam looked up, slightly surprised but still composed. Of course, she retrieved the ticket from her coat pocket and handed it over. Rachel glanced at it quickly, then looked at Miriam, then back at the seat number. "This is a first-class seat," she said, her smile fading. "I know," Miriam replied gently. "Are you traveling alone?" She returned the ticket, but didn't walk away. Instead, she leaned in and lowered her voice. "There may have been a mistake. This area is reserved for premium customers. I need you to come with me to verify." Miriam didn't waver. "There is no mistake. This is my seat." Rachel still didn't back off. Her hand rested lightly on the seat, an assertive gesture, one Miriam knew well after decades on the bench. No shouting, no force. Just the way people accustomed to giving orders usually did it. "I'm asking you to move to the back," she said. "We'll sort this out after takeoff." The man in seat 2B glanced over, but then buried his head back into his phone. Miriam closed her book, slipped the receipt between the pages, returned it to her bag, and stood up calmly. Rachel stepped aside. No arguing, no scene. Just a quiet, deliberate yielding. As she walked past the rows of seats, a few people turned to look, but most quickly looked away. She heard a woman whisper to her seatmate in row 5. "Poor thing must have gotten on the wrong flight." Miriam didn't respond. She only tightened her grip on her bag. The economy cabin was nearly full, overhead bins cluttered with luggage. She found a seat near the rear window of the plane. She sat down, neatly adjusted her bag at her feet, and placed her hands gently on her lap. No tears, no anger, just quietly pulled out her phone. She opened a secure app, an internal tool of the judiciary that few people knew about. Her fingers typed slowly. Rachel Whitman, Gate 14. Flight PH317. Unauthorized displacement. Verify. Forward. She hit send, then placed the phone face down on her lap and waited. The sounds inside the cabin were steady, as if everything were perfectly normal. A baby ahead let out a soft cry, then was soothed by its mother. Overhead, a luggage bin slammed shut. Flight attendants moved efficiently, checking seatbelts, smiling, performing their familiar pre-takeoff routine. Miriam Cross sat in seat 33F at the back of the plane, watching the light reflect through the small window. Her hands rested loosely together. Her breathing was even. From the outside, she looked like any other passenger. Maybe a little older, maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. And inside, there was silence, not from apathy nor from anger. Just yet, but a precise kind of silence forged over years of listening to lies in courtrooms, of impassive hours of cross-examination, of issuing heavy sentences where the heart could not override reason. And this moment was one of those. No noise, no protest, just control the breath, hold the silence, and wait. She had sat through hours of testimony without a flicker on her face, had weighed decisions that would alter the course of others' lives without letting heart override reason. That was what this moment demanded. Not volume, not confrontation. Just steady breathing, restraint, discipline. Judge Miriam Cross looked down at the screen of her phone. It had gone dark, but she knew the message had been sent. Of that she was certain. She expected no reply. Miriam was not the kind of person who waited for permission to act. And the person on the other end of that message, that person understood exactly what every word she had written meant. She slipped the phone into the inner pocket of her coat and leaned back slightly in her seat. The fabric of the economy cabin was rougher than first class, the cushioning thinner. Her knees nearly touched the seat in front of her. But what bothered her wasn't the seat. It was Rachel Whitman's gaze. There had been no malice, only a look shaped by trained suspicion, like someone examining an equation and realizing the numbers didn't add up. Black woman, worn leather bag, gray coat, seat 2A. There was something about her that Rachel couldn't reconcile. Miriam had seen that look many times. In courtrooms, of course, but also in restaurants, hotel lobbies, reception desks, and even while passing through security at federal buildings where her ID badge clearly read United States District Court. Those looks weren't accompanied by slurs. They came with unspoken questions, hesitation, sharp little cuts that didn't bleed, but drained all the same. And even so, she had never responded with argument. That wasn't her way. People always expected women like her to push back loudly, to rage to demand. But what they were never prepared to face was someone who didn't react. That was her power. She turned to look out the window. Outside, the tarmac remained still. Baggage carts rolled slowly across the concrete. A ground crew member waved toward the aircraft stairs. Time seemed to tilt. That moment between boarding and takeoff always had a strange quality. A shadow passed down the aisle. Another flight attendant, younger, a black woman with warm brown eyes, paused gently. "Ma'am, do you need anything?" she asked, her voice soft as wind. Miriam looked up, their eyes meeting. "No pity, just recognition." "No, thank you. I'm fine," she answered. The attendant nodded and continued on. That brief exchange, just 2 seconds, was enough to soothe something in her chest. Not much, but enough to remind her she wasn't entirely invisible. In first class, Rachel Whitman was pouring sparkling water for a businessman in a suit. The man barely noticed or pretended not to, what had just occurred. Rachel still wore the same smile, still said the familiar words, but the clipboard was gone, and with it, the certainty in her step. She no longer checked the passenger list, didn't feel the need. The woman had left the cabin. The problem had been resolved, but of course it hadn't. Rachel could feel it. The silence. Judge Cross left behind wasn't the usual kind. It was a silence, like smoke suspended in still air, visible, tangible, and impossible to ignore. She tried to push the feeling away, rearranging an already neat stack of napkins in the galley near row 33. At the back of the plane, Miriam took out her book again. She opened to a page, but her eyes didn't read the words. In her mind, she thought of her father. Not because he had gone through moments like this, though he had, but because of how he faced them. Don't imitate their emotions. He had once told her, imitate their discipline. That's how we win. He had taught high school chemistry for 38 years in Montgomery, Alabama. Never once raised his voice in class. Never needed to. When interrupted, he simply stopped speaking. When someone mistook him for the janitor, he would just smile and say, "Need me to mop something Miriam had inherited, that not just the quiet, but the steel beneath it." The plane gave a soft shudder as the doors sealed shut. The crew began their final checks. The captain's voice came over the speaker. "Welcome aboard Pacific Horizon Flight 315 to Atlanta. Clear skies ahead. Flight time approximately 3 hours. Please relax and prepare for departure." Click seatbelts, click shut. Flight attendants walked the aisles, checking trays, folding seat backs, smiling as usual. Noise-canceling headphones came on. But Miriam didn't move, didn't sip water, didn't smile, didn't nod. She sat there completely still, not out of stubbornness, but because she had made up her mind. And if anyone had been truly watching, they would have seen what Rachel Whitman had missed, the kind of silence that wasn't surrender. It was a warning. In the air, over 15 years, Rachel had flown countless routes, endured early mornings, late flights, irritable passengers, lost baggage, and smiles honed like badges on a uniform. She wasn't new. She was what the airline called reliable. Always on time. Never called out. Could mix a Bloody Mary without glancing at the label, and she always believed she could read people. From the moment she saw the woman in seat 2A, she had felt something was off. The woman didn't match the typical first-class profile. Not that Rachel was prejudiced, but after all those years flying, she was used to a pattern. Business travelers, retired executives, VIP guests, sometimes a uniformed service member. But that woman, old gray coat, unbranded leather bag, scuffed shoes. No rolling suitcase like most, just a worn leather satchel as if bought from a thrift store. She didn't look like someone who sat in first class. She acted like someone in the wrong seat. And that was the moment Rachel made her move. In first class, one usually sees busy executives, retired directors, sharply dressed travelers, and occasionally a soldier in uniform or a VIP guest. But the woman this morning was different. A plain gray coat, no brand, worn-out shoes, an old leather bag, without wheels. Nothing stood out as if it had been picked up at a thrift store in a residential neighborhood. She didn't have the look of someone familiar with first class. She had the look of someone passing through, not someone who belonged. And so, Rachel Whitman did what her instincts told her. She asked to see the ticket. And even though the ticket matched perfectly with seat 2A, even though the woman calmly confirmed that it was indeed her seat, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She wasn't rude, didn't raise her voice, always kept her hands where they should be. Just a gentle nudge, both literal and figurative enough to encourage a move to restore the natural order. At least, that was how Rachel saw it. She didn't dislike the woman. She wasn't even annoyed. To her, it was simply a matter of fit, of making sure first class maintained its standards. But now, as she moved through the cabin, pouring drinks, adjusting luggage, a new discomfort began to creep in. The moment the woman stood up kept replaying in her head. No argument, no attitude, just a calm sharpness like the edge of a blade. And that silence, that was what unsettled Rachel the most. She hated that kind of silence. It was like static electricity, invisible, but it clung to you. In the galley near the rear rows, Kayla Brooks, a young flight attendant still new to the job, was preparing the beverage cart. She was still learning when to smile and when to take a step back. But even Kayla had felt the tension from the earlier incident. She glanced forward where Rachel moved briskly from row to row. Her steps were still on rhythm, but her shoulders were a bit tense. Her eyes darted too quickly. Kayla recognized that look, the expression of someone pretending everything was fine. She turned to Noah Lynn, another member of the crew, and quietly asked, "That seat thing earlier? Was that normal?" Noah shrugged, still stacking coffee stirs into a tray. "Rachel's like that," sometimes he murmured. "She follows the rules, unless the rules don't match how she feels." "Feels?" Kayla frowned. Noah didn't answer. He simply gave her a side glance, one that clearly said, "If you want to make it through training, best not to ask more questions." In the first-class galley, Rachel was refolding already perfect napkins. She checked the ice bin for the third time, refolded 2 blankets that were already fine, but nothing eased her mind. She hated when things slipped out of their lanes. It made her feel exposed, and that woman, whoever she was, had knocked the system out of sync. Not by arguing, not by resisting, but by not reacting at all. That was what gnawed at Rachel. 2 months ago, she had faced a similar situation. A young man in first class wearing a hoodie and sneakers. His ticket was perfectly valid. She hadn't said anything harsh, just asked a few too many questions. He had recorded the entire exchange and posted it online. She'd been called into HR, required to complete retraining. Things eventually blew over, but ever since she'd felt like she was walking on thin ice. One slip, one viral clip, one accusation, and the wings she'd worn for 15 years could be taken away in a heartbeat. So this morning, when she saw the woman in seat 2A, her first response wasn't just instinct. It was fear, dressed in the uniform of procedure. And now that fear had returned, tapped her on the shoulder like a cold hand. She tried to brush it off. She had checked the ticket. The passenger list showed no such name in first class. Maybe it was a booking error. She was just maintaining order. Keeping the flight smooth, that was her job. Making sure everyone was in their proper place. And yet, that sentence kept ringing in her mind. This is my assigned seat. No defensiveness, no confusion, no fear, just calm and certainty. People only speak like that when they know something, when they hold power, real power. And Rachel began to feel that her mistake was bigger than just a seat. At the back row, Miriam Cross remained seated. She wasn't reading anymore. Her eyes followed the sunlight trailing gently along the window frame. Her hands were folded, gaze serene. But beneath that stillness, a slow current of awareness stirred. She could sense the shift. She didn't need to look to know that Rachel Whitman was unsettled. People like her always gave it away sooner or later. They tightened their lips, busied their hands, avoided certain rows. Miriam knew it well. Power made people uneasy when they didn't know where it came from. Her whole life, she had entered rooms where she wasn't expected. Boardrooms, hotels' first-class cabins. She had never needed to raise her voice to prove herself. She only needed to be present, and her presence required no permission. Rachel passed by again, this time more slowly. A few passengers looked up. One woman adjusted her posture. A man pulled his cap lower over his eyes. The atmosphere wasn't exactly tense, but it was no longer relaxed. Something had shifted, and that shift hadn't come from shouting, not from chaos. It came from a glance, a silence, a decision. Rachel caught sight of Kayla watching her. Their eyes met for just a beat. Then Kayla quickly looked away. Rachel Whitman felt it too. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop a few degrees, not because of the air conditioning, but from a quiet chill spreading outward from silence itself. In the cockpit, Captain Lucas Grant adjusted his headset. The internal phone buzzed softly next to him. He picked it up. The cabin door had been locked with a crisp clack, the sound of the bolt echoing faintly down the rows of seats. The overhead bins were all closed. The safety video screen began to play familiar images. Passengers were settled, believing this morning's flight would pass smoothly. In the last row, Judge Miriam Cross didn't move. She sat upright, seatbelt fastened, gaze fixed on the window. Calm. The engines hadn't started yet. There was still time. She didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but she knew something would, and she had made sure it would. In first class, Rachel stood in the galley area, hands loosely folded in front of her stomach, eyes glued to the screen, as if watching the safety video for the first time. But in truth, she wasn't seeing anything. Her mind was replaying for the 5th time the look the woman in seat 2A had given her. Not angry, not confused, just certain, and that certainty had unraveled Rachel more than any outburst ever could. 3 rows back, a man in a gray blazer adjusted his laptop. When the incident occurred, he hadn't even looked up. Like many others, he had chosen apathy over involvement. But now he couldn't stop his eyes from drifting forward. Something felt off. And then it happened. A brief beep from the speaker. The captain's voice came through, even emotionless. "Miss Whitman, please report to the cockpit." Rachel froze for half a second, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. The other attendants turned to look. Noah Lynn raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She forced a smile and walked forward. The first-class curtain swayed lightly behind her, as if marking the boundary just crossed. When the door closed behind her, Miriam didn't need to turn around to know it had begun. She took a slow, steady breath, loosely folded her hands in her lap. A nearby passenger noticed the change, the way her shoulders relaxed slightly as if surfacing from underwater after holding a long breath. Inside the cockpit, Captain Grant glanced at his counterpart, tapping lightly on the clipboard. "You remember the passenger in 2A?" Rachel nodded slightly. "Yes. I thought there was a seat assignment error. Did you confirm that error? Her name wasn't listed in first class." She answered too quickly. "And the ticket he pressed?" I glanced at it. It matched the seat. Rachel hesitated. "But she didn't look like someone who usually sits there." Captain Grant stared at her. Then he spoke with no hesitation. "That woman is Judge Miriam Cross, a federal judge with the Eastern District of Virginia, currently presiding over a case involving 3 major defense contractors, including one that owns 18% of our airline's parent company." Rachel swallowed hard. She just filed a misconduct report through the judiciary's internal channel, accusing us of unlawful displacement. He continued. No need to raise his voice. Each word landed like a hammer, tapping gently on the table. "Legal has instructed de-escalate immediately. We're returning to the gate. The Aviation Safety Bureau will be involved. We haven't taken off yet," she whispered. "Exactly," he replied. "And we won't not until this is resolved." He turned away. "You will return to her, publicly apologize, and escort her back to first class." Rachel stood frozen. The cockpit now felt no different from a courtroom, and she was no longer in control. When she stepped out, her expression had changed. Her posture, stiff lips pressed tight. The curtain behind her fell closed gently. Every eye in first class turned to her. They didn't know exactly what had happened, but every passenger could feel something had shifted. She began the walk back down the aisle. The once confident click of her heels now sounded like a countdown clock. Each step measured. Passengers in business class paused their movies. A few leaned to the side for a better look. A young couple whispered, craning their necks. At row 33, she stopped before the woman. She had displaced an hour earlier, still straight-backed, still composed like a silent storm dressed in civilian clothes. "Judge Cross," she said, lowering her voice. Miriam turned her head slowly. "Yes." Rachel bent slightly, just enough to meet her eye level. "It seems there was a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your seat in first class." The words sounded memorized. Thin, frail, like scaffolding against a gust of wind, Miriam didn't blink. A misunderstanding. She repeated. Rachel nodded. "Your name didn't show up correctly in the system, but it's been confirmed now." Miriam held her gaze. "I see." She picked up her bag slowly. No rush, no fumbling. She stood, not as someone returning to a seat, but as someone reclaiming what had always been hers. Before moving, she turned to Rachel, her voice soft but clear. "You said I didn't belong there." Rachel's face tightened. "I didn't mean." "You touched me," Miriam said, cutting her off. Not angry, not loud, just clear, decisive. A man across the aisle paused mid-sip of his coffee. Rachel Whitman took a thin breath. "I only touched her lightly," she said, her voice small, like a plea spoken to herself. Miriam Cross didn't respond. She turned and began walking toward the front of the plane. Every gaze along the aisle followed her. Every row she passed fell into its own kind of silence, the silence of realization. Some bowed their heads. Others shifted in their seats, adjusting awkwardly. The man in seat 2B, who had said nothing earlier, now sat upright, eyes fixed on the floor. Rachel followed behind, empty-handed. For the first time in 15 years of work, she had nothing left to say. The aisle was no longer just a path through the plane. It was a current of gazes. The air was heavy, as if an invisible hand had pressed down on every shoulder. No one had spoken when Miriam was asked to leave. No one had stepped in when she was questioned, asked to move, touched. And now it was too late to pretend none of it had happened. The man in 2B shifted as she approached. She glanced at him, not coldly, not accusingly, just enough to acknowledge his presence. He stood slightly to give her room. "Welcome back," he mumbled. Miriam gave a slight nod. "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. He sat again, fumbling with his seatbelt, his tray table, his phone, anything to avoid her eyes. Behind her, Rachel remained standing, as if waiting for an order that would never come. The apology had been made, the gesture completed, but the air had not cleared. It hung thick, clinging to every step she took. She turned back quietly, retreating toward the galley. Her footsteps no longer echoed with confidence. The self-assurance she once wore fell away, layer by layer, as she passed two passengers who had witnessed everything. A middle-aged woman looked at her and gently shook her head. Not a word, but it stung more than any rebuke. Back in seat 2O. Miriam sat down. She folded her coat neatly on her lap and placed her bag back beneath the seat. No dramatic gestures, no demand for attention. But this time, everyone noticed. The man in seat 2C, perhaps around 70, sharply dressed with an old military pin on his lapel, cleared his throat. I saw what happened earlier," he said quietly, trying not to draw attention. "It was unfortunate." Miriam turned to him, her face unreadable. "Unfortunate?" He hesitated. "I mean, clearly a misunderstanding. I'm sure she didn't mean." Miriam tilted her head. "Did you say anything when it happened?" He paused. I didn't think it was my place." "Exactly," Miriam gave a small nod. "I understand." She turned back toward the window. He said nothing more. In the galley, Rachel leaned against the counter, hands gripping a stack of napkins that didn't need folding. Her eyes stared blankly into space. Kayla Brooks stepped in behind her, checking the inventory clipboard. She stopped when she saw Rachel's expression. "You okay?" she asked gently. Rachel nodded too quickly. "Yeah, fine." Kayla didn't press, but she didn't walk away either. Eventually, she asked, was her ticket really wrong? Rachel didn't answer immediately. Then, almost in a whisper, "She didn't look like someone who belonged in that seat. I didn't want to risk it. We've had people sneak on before." Kayla frowned, but she had the right ticket and a federal ID. Rachel looked down at her hands. "I didn't look closely." Kayla didn't say, "Then it was wrong." She didn't say, "You caused a problem." She just stood there silently for a moment, then said, "That wasn't good." Rachel nodded slowly. "No, it wasn't." Back in seat 2A. Miriam wasn't reading. The book lay open in her lap, but her mind had drifted far. The cabin was quiet now, but not peaceful. It was the stillness after an alarm bell, the moment when everyone pretends they didn't hear it. She could feel it in the way the attendants walked, the way passengers moved, the way drinks were accepted without exchanged glances. No one knew what to say, so they said nothing, but silence is never neutral. It tells stories. It says, "I saw you get pushed, and I said nothing. I heard what she said, and I didn't step in. I thought it wasn't my business until I found out who you were. The last one was the hardest to bear." The phone in her coat pocket buzzed softly. She opened it slightly, tilting the screen to shield it from view. A message from her father. Everything confirmed. "Stay seated. Aviation Safety Bureau is escalating. You don't need to do anything else. Let me handle the rest." That simple message from her father made Miriam Cross smile faintly. Not because she felt vindicated, but because for the first time in a long while, the system she had spent her life upholding was beginning to correct itself. She didn't reply. There was no need. Nothing more to say. One row back, a young woman whispered to her seatmate, "Do you think she's someone important?" I think the young man whispered back, "They messed with the wrong person." At 35,000 feet, Miriam Cross gazed out toward the horizon. Calm, steady. The confrontation had begun. Not with shouting, not with an explosive reaction. It began when a woman was asked to leave her seat because of how she looked, and it continued, because no one could explain why. That question lingered in the cabin like a hairline crack. Why didn't we speak up? And in that silence, Miriam was not small, not angry, not afraid. She simply was undeniably present. The plane was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was the hush that follows a shock when everyone has seen too much but said too little. Miriam Cross sat in seat. Her demeanor as composed as it had been the first time she sat down, but the atmosphere around her was no longer the same. Every glance was more careful now, more guarded, as if the entire cabin were holding its breath, uncertain what would happen next. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She had long mastered the art of reading a room without reacting. She was a judge, and that role demanded not the right to speak, but the discipline to remain silent at the right time. She leaned gently back in her seat, tilted her head toward the window, and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to think. There is a kind of pain no one notices, the pain of preserving dignity. People assume composure means peace, that if you don't protest, you must not be hurt. But that's not true. Miriam was not unfeeling. She was simply controlled. There had been countless moments like this in her life, times when she had to weigh whether speaking up was worth the cost, and many times she chose silence. Not out of cowardice, but because she knew the world rarely listens to women of color unless they are already broken. So she learned to make silence weigh more than words. And today she had done just that. She took out her phone from her coat pocket. A new message from Chief Justice Layton. Referral received. Taking action. Don't worry about the process. You're protected. Miriam smiled. Classic Layton, sharp and efficient. She had once mentored him when he was still a clerk, still wearing cheap ties and doubting himself. Now he was head of the federal judiciary. And when Miriam sent her silent signal through the internal channel, he had acted without hesitation. She typed back a single line. Thank you. No spotlight needed, just enforcement. No media, no interviews, no dramatic apologies, just real consequences. Because consequences were what mattered. In the cockpit, Captain Lucas Grant was speaking quietly to a supervisory representative from the Aviation Safety Bureau through his headset. The referral from Judge Cross had triggered a special audit code, one that couldn't be ignored. There are very few positions in government where a single message can halt a flight mid-runway. A federal judge is one of them, especially a judge presiding over cases involving major defense contractors, especially when her silence carries more weight than a public confrontation. At the front of first class, Rachel Whitman stood motionless. She stared at the small sink as if it might offer some kind of explanation. Her hands trembled as she opened a bag of plastic cups, each one crackling as it came free. Kayla Brooks approached again, this time more slowly. They said, "The flight probably won't take off right away," she said quietly. Rachel didn't respond. Kayla waited a moment, then asked softly, "She's not just a regular passenger, is she?" Rachel clenched her jaw. "No, she's a federal judge." Kayla exhaled slowly. "Now it makes sense," Rachel muttered almost to herself. "She didn't threaten me. Didn't say an angry word. She just stood up, just looked at me." No words between them, but the silence had said it all. Some people don't need to raise their voices to make things happen. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't speak. A few rows back, a teenager asked his mother, "Mom, what's a federal judge?" The mother leaned in and replied softly, "Someone who decides very important cases. One of the most powerful people in the legal system." "So is she famous?" "No," the mother said. "She's powerful. That's different." Miriam slipped her phone away. No more messages needed. She had done what she came to do. But inside, she knew something had shifted. This wasn't the first time someone had assumed she didn't belong. Not the first time her ID had been questioned twice. Not the first time she'd been asked to please move to the back. But this time she'd had enough. Maybe it was her age. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the accumulation of hundreds of quiet injuries. Never in the news, never remembered, but leaving scars. And this time, she didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to explain, didn't need to ask to be respected. 'Cause dignity isn't something you request. It's something you carry. Even without speaking, she had brought the entire plane to a halt. Dignity, it isn't something you wear. It's something you carry. And sometimes you have to remind others they never had the right to take it from you. Across the aisle, the man in seat 2B still hadn't spoken, but he kept glancing over furtive, uneasy looks weighed down by unspoken guilt. He knew what he should have done. He knew it when it happened, and now he knew it even more clearly. But the moment had passed, and silence always outlives guilt. At the back of the cabin, a baby cried, then stopped. Miriam. Cross didn't move. She closed her eyes, not from fatigue, but because the wheels were already in motion and she no longer needed to steer them. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about the next person who might be judged by their skin color, their shoes, or their worn coat. About all those who had ever been quietly pushed to the back without resistance. Because resistance doesn't always need sound. It had already echoed louder than a scream, and it wasn't finished. In the cockpit, Captain Lucas Grant kept a steady hand on the controls. His eyes moved between the altitude display and the internal comms panel. Outside, the Pine Ridge mountain range glowed under the early sun, serene, almost eerily. But inside the cabin, the air was tight as a drawn bowstring. A chime rang on the panel. Another message from Central Command. Hold position at original gate. FAA supervisor en route. Do not taxi. He exhaled slowly, pressed the PA button. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an internal procedural inspection, our departure will be delayed while we remain at the gate. Thank you for your understanding. He released the button and leaned back. Not a lie. But far from the whole truth. A few passengers looked up. Others just sighed, used to unexplained delays. A man in seat 1D glanced at his watch and muttered about a connection in Denver, though this plane wasn't going there. But several eyes shifted toward 2A, toward the woman who had been removed and then returned, whose presence seemed to have stopped the entire aircraft. Miriam didn't move, didn't react. She sat still, hands gently folded in her lap, seatbelt fastened. She didn't need to speak, because she already had. In the galley, Rachel Whitman stiffened at the captain's voice. 3 words she caught. Hold position. Her stomach twisted. Not taking off. Not because of maintenance. Because someone was watching. Someone was intervening. She moved like a shadow, picking up an untouched coffee cup and dropping it into the trash. Kayla Brooks glanced over, then looked toward the sealed cockpit door. It's because of her, isn't it? She whispered. Rachel didn't answer, but they both knew. On the jet bridge, a tall black man approached, wearing a dark blue FAA jacket, clipboard in hand, clear glasses, a badge on his chest. Deshaun Hayes, Federal Supervisor. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Behind him were 2 airline representatives, visibly pale. They said nothing. The cabin door opened with a sharp hiss. A few passengers at the front turned to look. No one was sure what was happening. Maintenance, security, emergency. But an FAA officer walking in with airline reps. That was never routine. Hayes stepped onto the plane like entering a courtroom. His eyes swept the rows. When he reached the front, he glanced briefly at Miriam. No nod, no wave. Just a subtle shift in posture. Just enough for those who understood. To understand, Miriam recognized it instantly. Recognition. Respect. A signal of action. Good morning, Hayes said clearly, loud enough for all of first class to hear. We've received a federal oversight alert. All flight crew will hold position. Lead attendant, step forward. The cabin went completely silent. Rachel felt every cell in her body freeze. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. She pulled back the curtain, clipboard in hand, like a shield. I'm Rachel Whitman, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Whitman Hayes replied, eyes unreadable. Follow me to the forward galley. No shouting, no threat, but every passenger from rows 1 to 5 sat up straighter, in the galley out of sight. Hayes lowered his voice, but it was still firm and unmistakable. We've received an official report. Oversight code. 117B, passenger cross seat C20. Rachel swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry. She was asked to move because of her appearance. Hayes continued. The manifest confirms her name in 20. Boarding pass scan data shows no error. Rachel opened her mouth. I'm not here for an explanation. Hayes cut in. I'm here for accountability. He turned to the airline representative. Under federal regulation, this flight is now classified as non-compliant. It cannot depart until a formal report is filed and crew reassignment is considered. The airline rep turned ashen. You're grounding the crew. No, Hayes said, I'm addressing a situation. And this situation was created by a choice. When every eye turned to her, every silence became a voice. Rachel Whitman stood still, unmoving. In 15 years, she had never felt so completely stripped of control as she did now, in seat 2A. Miriam Cross didn't budge. No smirk, no triumph. Just a hand brushing once over the edge of her coat, then resting gently on her lap. Across the aisle, the man in 2B stared at her as if truly seeing her for the first time, and realizing this wasn't just a woman reclaiming her seat, but someone who could stop time without saying a word. In the galley, Kayla Brooks kept watching, her eyes darting between Rachel and Hayes. Then she did something small, but brave, sir. She almost whispered, "I witnessed the incident. If a statement is needed, I'm willing." Hayes turned to her, his gaze serious. "Your name, Kayla Brooks, Junior Flight Attendant." He nodded slightly. "You'll be contacted." Rachel didn't look at her, and Kayla didn't expect her to. Hayes exited the plane, but the cabin still felt compressed. The pressure no longer came from altitude, but from the moment itself. The door sealed shut, and no one dared exhale. Minutes later, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be delayed an additional 20 minutes. Thank you for your patience." It wasn't the voice of someone commanding a flight. Yeah, it was the voice of someone who knew the plane was no longer in his hands. It belonged to the woman in seat 2. Miriam Cross exhaled softly, not because the burden had lifted, but because the balance had shifted. In first class, Rachel Whitman had never heard silence ring so loudly. No one spoke. No one read a newspaper. No one tapped their phone. They weren't waiting for takeoff. They were waiting for something to land, and it was falling squarely on Rachel. She leaned against the service cart, shoulders, stiff eyes locked onto the stainless steel wall. The door was shut, not for takeoff, but to seal this moment. Everyone knew it. From the cockpit, Captain Lucas Grant spoke again, this time briefly, politely, but with a distinct shift in tone. "Ms. Whitman, please prepare the cabin for emergency inspection. Not ready for takeoff, not prepare for landing, but inspection." Rachel stepped out of the galley trying to maintain composure, but she didn't get far. A security officer boarded the aircraft, not TSA. He wore a blazer, DOJ insignia, and an FAA badge. Behind him was David Larson, Senior Director of the airline's Crisis and Customer Affairs Division. A man who never flew commercial unless something had gone very, very wrong. Larson entered the cabin like he was walking into a crisis room after a scandal. "Ms. Whitman," he said bluntly with no preamble. "Yes, sir." He didn't lower his voice. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty pending investigation. Please collect your belongings. You will be escorted off the aircraft." Heads began to turn. This was no longer whispers behind a curtain. This was public, sir. This is not a discussion. Larson cut in. "You will have a chance to respond, but not here and not now." The security officer stepped forward, gesturing toward the exit. "Ma'am," he said, motioning to the door. Rachel's hands trembled. She looked down the length of the cabin as if searching for someone. Some eye contact. Some reason this might not be real. But no one looked back. Not even Kayla. She turned forward stiffly, like putting on a mask of composure that no longer fit. She retrieved her coat from the hook, draped it over her arm like a shadow, and began the long walk of consequence. This time, there were no echoing heels. Only slow, heavy steps. She passed through the front rows. Someone quickly lowered their phone, but it was clear they had been recording. Others just stared, uncertain whether to meet her gaze or pretend they had never stood silently beside her. She walked past Miriam Cross, their eyes met, and in that moment Rachel saw what she had missed all along. Not judgment, not revenge, but pain endured for far too long. Miriam didn't smile. Didn't speak. She didn't need to. Some verdicts come from the judge's bench. Others unfold in the aisle of a plane that never left the ground. Rachel Whitman stepped off the plane. The door hissed closed, not just from cabin pressure, but as if sealing away an old version of herself. In the cabin, the air changed again. Not peaceful, but different. The woman in 2A was no longer just a passenger. She was a presence, a confrontation without sound, a silent lesson the entire cabin would carry with them. The man in 2B cleared his throat. He had been silent for nearly an hour, but now something inside him couldn't stay quiet. He leaned slightly toward Miriam. "I should have said something earlier," he said softly. "I saw it. I thought it wasn't my place." Miriam looked at him, her voice light as wind. "I understand." Then she added, "But silence is always a position." When all eyes turned toward her, every silence became a voice. Rachel Whitman stood motionless. In 15 years, she had never once felt so completely stripped of control as she did now. In seat 2A, Miriam Cross still hadn't moved. No smug smile, no prideful posture. Only a hand lightly tracing the edge of her coat, then resting gently on her thigh. Across the aisle, the man in seat 2B stared as if truly seeing her for the first time, and realizing this wasn't just a woman reclaiming a seat, but someone who could stop time without saying a word. In the galley, Caleb Brooks kept watching, her eyes shifting between Rachel and Hayes. Then she did something small, but brave, sir. She whispered, "I witnessed the incident. If you need a statement, I'm willing." Hayes turned toward her, serious. "Your name?" "Caleb Brooks, junior attendant." He nodded. "You'll be contacted." Rachel didn't look at her, and Kayla didn't expect her to. Hayes left the aircraft, but the pressure in the cabin didn't ease. It wasn't about altitude anymore. The door closed with a hiss, but no one sighed in relief. Minutes later, the captain's voice came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be delayed another 20 minutes. Thank you for your patience." It wasn't the voice of someone steering a plane. It was the voice of someone who knew the plane was no longer in their hands. It belonged to seat 2A. Miriam Cross exhaled softly, not because the burden had lifted, but because the balance had shifted. In first class, Rachel Whitman had never heard silence this loud. No one spoke. No one flipped through a magazine. No one tapped on their phones. They weren't waiting to take off. They were waiting for something to land, and it was landing directly on Rachel. She leaned against the cart, her shoulders stiff, her gaze boring through the galley wall. The door was closed, not for departure, but to seal this moment in place, and everyone knew it. From the cockpit, Captain Lucas Grant's voice came again, brief, polite, and unmistakably different. "Ms. Whitman, please prepare the cabin for emergency inspection. Not prepare for takeoff, not prepare for landing, just inspection." Rachel stepped out of the galley, composed barely, but she didn't get far. An airport security officer boarded, not TSA. He wore a blazer, a Department of Justice insignia, and an FAA badge. Behind him was David Larson, Senior Director, Crisis and Customer Affairs for the airline. A man who never flew commercial unless something had gone very, very wrong. Larson entered the cabin like a CEO walking into a crisis room. "Post-scandal, Ms. Whitman," he said plainly. "Yes, sir." He didn't lower his voice. "Effective immediately, you are suspended. Pending investigation, please collect your personal items. You will be escorted off the aircraft." Heads turned. No more whispers behind curtains. "This was public, sir. This is not a conversation." Larson cut her off. "You'll have a chance to respond, but not here. Not now." The security officer stepped forward, gesturing toward the exit. "Ma'am." He said. Rachel's hands trembled. She looked toward the back as if searching for an ally, a reason this wasn't real. But no one met her gaze, not even Kayla. She turned back, stiff composure layered over panic, like a poorly fitting mask. She pulled her coat from the hook, slung it over her arm like a shadow, and began her walk of consequence. No click of heels this time, just slow, heavy steps. She passed through the front rows. Someone hurried to lower their phone, but it was obvious they were recording. Others just stared, unsure whether to look directly or pretend they hadn't shared in the silence. She walked past Miriam Cross. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Rachel saw what she hadn't before. Not judgment, not revenge, but pain endured far too long. Miriam didn't smile, didn't speak. She didn't need to. Some verdicts come from a judge's bench. Others unfold in the aisle of a plane that never took off. Rachel Whitman exited the aircraft. The door hissed closed, not just from pressurization, but as if sealing shut an old version of herself. In the cabin, the atmosphere changed again, not exactly peace, but something different. The woman in 2A was no longer just a passenger. She was a presence, a confrontation without sound, a quiet lesson the entire cabin would carry with them. The man in 2B cleared his throat. He had been silent for nearly an hour, but now something in him refused to stay quiet. He leaned slightly toward Miriam. "May I say something?" he asked. Miriam turned, waiting. "I hesitated earlier," he said. "When she asked you for your ticket, when she told you to move, I wanted to say something, but I thought, maybe you were fine, or maybe I misunderstood." Miriam listened. "I was wrong," he added, "and I'm sorry." She gave a slight nod, then said something that surprised him. "You're not the only one who's been silent for too long." As the plane began its descent into Chicago airspace, the flight attendants moved briskly through the cabin, performing final checks. But the atmosphere on board was no longer the usual bustle of a flight's closing minutes. No rustling of bags, no sighs of relief before landing. Only silence, but a silence weighted with meaning. Everyone sat upright. Everyone knew exactly where they were. In the cockpit, Captain Lucas Grant received one final message before landing. It didn't come from the airline. It was a priority alert from the Federal Aviation Administration's Judicial Response Channel. The subject line read, "Incident report filed. Passenger Miriam Cross. Priority observational." He said nothing, just tilted his head toward the co-pilot and said calmly, "Focus on landing. This one isn't routine." In seat 2A. Miriam Cross gazed out the window. The skyline of Chicago cut across the thin cloud layer. A familiar city, but it looked different now. Not because the city had changed, but because she had. She knew what awaited below wouldn't be chaos, but conversation. It wouldn't begin with a press conference, but with passengers who had witnessed it all. The plane had been on the tarmac at O'Hare for nearly 40 minutes, and still Judge Miriam Cross hadn't left her seat. She remained in 2A posture, upright coat folded neatly on her lap. The seatbelt sign was off. The seat in front had been returned to upright, but she didn't move. Not because she was waiting, but because others were. Outside the plane, a small group had gathered at gate B-27. Not a crowd, not the press, not yet. Just people in Navy suits wearing hard-edged name badges standing straight as if to say, "We were summoned." Now we're trying to understand why among them a representative from the Department of Transportation, an aide to a state senator, and a senior liaison from the airline's corporate communications team. Behind them, a press assistant from the Judicial Accountability Committee whispered into an earpiece, jotting notes rapidly into a notebook. What they all had in common. None of them were prepared for this. No one expected a digital storm to begin midair, let alone one that began in silence. The story had spread in less than 2 hours. The clip of Rachel Whitman being escorted off the plane had hit 2 million views on X. The hashtag Your seat 2A was trending not only in the U.S., but also in the U.K. and Canada. In the comments, veterans, officials, law professors, airline staff. I served 22 years in the Air Force. I know that look. Shameful, and she stayed composed. I teach law. This case is going on my syllabus next semester. Then there was one comment no PR team could outspin. She never raised her voice. The world did it for her inside the terminal. A woman in a beige suit passed her phone to a colleague. "You know who she is, right?" she whispered. "Federal Judge Miriam Cross. The Simmons Securities case. The defense contractor. Bribery 1. "Yeah, that's her silence." Then the colleague said quietly, "Someone's getting fired." The woman shook her head. "No, someone's getting investigated." At the Chicago Regional Executive Office of the airline CEO, Matthew Klee stared at a plasma screen. His phone buzzed every 10 seconds. Legal PR. The board, government affairs. Everyone had an opinion, but only one person held real power, and she was still in seat 2. He turned to the head of communications. "What have we got?" "Drafted an apology. Doesn't name her. Just refers to the incident. Promises internal review. Too vague." Matthew frowned. "Delete it. Start over." The room fell silent. This isn't a PR stumble. This is a federal judge filing an official complaint of discrimination. But we haven't confirmed. It was discrimination, the legal rep said hesitantly. Matthew looked at him. She had a valid ticket, was removed because of how she looked. The crew member admitted it. This isn't a gray area. This is textbook. On the screen was a photo of Miriam Cross seated calmly, coat on her lap. Eyes steady. "We're going to need more than an apology." On the plane. Miriam's phone buzzed. A message from an unlisted number office of the Chief Judge 7th Circuit. "We've been notified. FAA has escalated to Congressional Committee. Do not respond to media. We stand behind you." She locked the screen. A moment later, the first-class curtain parted. David Larson, the executive who had dismissed Rachel Whitman, entered. He moved carefully, like stepping into a courtroom. "Judge Cross," he said softly, "we're ready to escort you off the aircraft. The area is secure. There's press nearby, but we've arranged a private exit if you prefer." Miriam looked at him, her voice calm. "Is she still employed?" Larson hesitated. "Suspended pending investigation." "That's not an answer. She won't serve on any flights until a determination is made." "That I can promise you today," Miriam gave a slight nod. "Acceptable. For now." Then she rose from her seat. Robert Monroe rested his hand on the mahogany table, eyes fixed on his daughter. "So what do you want?" he asked. Voice steady, the tone of a judge who never really left the bench. Evelyn, now Judge Miriam Cross, answered plainly, "I want what every passenger deserves. A fair flight, and a system that knows when it needs to hold itself accountable." He nodded. "You plan to go public?" She lifted her teacup, took a small sip, then set it down. "I don't have to do anything. They already showed the world. My job is to make sure it doesn't fade with tomorrow's headlines." Robert looked at his daughter and saw in her eyes not just exhaustion, but a rare kind of clarity. "Then do it," he said, "not for revenge, but so the next person doesn't have to choose between silence and dignity." Miriam nodded and pulled out her phone, typing a brief email. "To the Executive Board. I will attend the meeting, but not behind closed doors. I want transcripts. I want witnesses. And I want change, not comfort." She hit send. Done. No drama, no fanfare, just precision. 3 days later at the Pacific Horizon headquarters, Miriam entered a glass-walled conference room filled with expensive suits and uneasy expressions. An electronic display at the back of the room read Crisis Oversight Review. Internal session. David Larson waited outside, the usual PR smile gone. "Thank you for coming," he said, courteous but wary. "Everyone's present." Miriam gave a slight nod. I didn't come to hear an apology. I came to verify a promise. Inside, the executive chair, head of legal, chief of operations, and a representative from the FAA were all seated. No one spoke first. She took her seat at the head of the table and opened her folder. Policy reform proposals. First, Miriam began, her voice as steady as a gavel. I want confirmation that the policy requiring staff to verify boarding passes before asking any passenger to vacate a seat will be implemented immediately. The head of legal nodded. Updated in the executive manual. Goes into effect within 72 hours. Second, I want a dedicated discrimination reporting channel for passengers. Not through in-flight crew, direct to an independent system. With responses logged and without labeling the passenger as difficult. The executive chair spoke up. We're developing a new app to integrate that channel. Beta release is scheduled for next quarter. Miriam nodded. And lastly, I want confirmation that bias awareness training will be mandatory. The COO slid the training schedule across the table. 12 hours minimum annually. Required for all staff, including management. She looked at everyone in the room. Good. But I will not sign any agreement in exchange for silence. The room fell still. I don't want a plaque. I don't need a PR campaign. I just want to make sure that the next woman in a gray coat with an old leather bag won't be treated like she doesn't belong, just because she doesn't look like someone's idea of first class. The next morning, on Pacific Horizon Airlines' official website, a statement appeared. A new commitment to equality in the skies. We acknowledge that we failed to uphold the rights of our passengers as we should have. We are changing not just for one person, but for everyone. There was no name mentioned, but in the first comment, a passenger wrote, I was on that flight. I didn't speak up, but I've learned silence is never neutral. And beneath that, a short line appeared. From an unverified account, no profile picture, Miriam Cross saw and stayed seated. I didn't come here to celebrate. I came here to clarify one thing. Silence is not always complicity. Sometimes it's strategy. And sometimes, when you remain silent long enough, others begin to listen. I don't regret not shouting. I don't see myself as weak for staying in my seat. On the contrary, I prove that you don't have to be loud to have a voice. Composure's a language, and that day it spoke for me. That day wasn't just a personal story, it was a reflection of a broader pattern. Every time someone is judged by appearance, by voice, by skin color, or by where they sit, it's a symptom of a system that needs fixing. I don't want what happened to me to become an exception, remembered only because it went viral. I want it to be the start of a new standard where passengers are verified by process, not prejudice, where flight crews are trained not just to ensure safety, but to protect dignity. I'm not standing here asking for pity. I don't need it. I'm standing here asking for accountability from airlines, from regulators, from every person who has ever seen something wrong and stayed silent. So if you're hearing me now, don't let this story end with me. Retell it. Question policies. Talk to your children. Ask your workplace whether their bias training is up to date. And remember, justice isn't some distant ideal. It starts with how we treat the person sitting next to us on a plane. She paused, letting her eyes scan the room. No one moved. No one coughed. A hush. Electric and full filled the space. I am Judge Miriam Cross, federal judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. But that day, I didn't need that title to know I had the right to stay in my seat. I only needed a printed boarding pass and the truth. I didn't demand respect. I let respect find me, and now I'm not asking for change. I'm demanding evolution. The audience rose in applause, not thunderous, not eruptive, but whole. A standing ovation, not just for what she said, but for how she had lived through it, not with anger, but with resolve. Outside the auditorium, a small group of reporters streamed live. The story had become national news. but now it was becoming history. Not because of scandal, but because of awakening. A cameraman whispered to his colleague as the lens kept rolling, "It's the first time I've seen someone say nothing and make the whole country listen." That evening, broadcasts across the U.S. replayed not only the clip from Flight Pacific Horizon 3117, but also the unscripted paperless speech of a woman once told she didn't belong where she sat. At the Pacific Horizon Airlines headquarters in Atlanta, CEO Matthew Kleen sat silently as the live stream ended. On his desk was a draft of a new policy, the Passenger Dignity Protocol. It included mandatory verification before reseating internal reporting without labels like disruptive, and required bias training for all frontline employees. Approve and release tomorrow morning. Matthew said no press conference, no excuses. Just action. Meanwhile, in a Minneapolis high school, a civics teacher began the next day's lesson by playing Judge Cross's speech. Beneath the board, the day's topic had been written. The loudest voice isn't always the right one. Sometimes silence is the most powerful warning we have. There are no winners in moments like these. Only clarity. I don't speak for applause. I speak because I know what it feels like to be seen as invisible, even while sitting in plain sight. And now that you've seen it, you can't pretend you haven't. The room fell silent, not from surprise, but from truth. "So what happens next?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Policy. I've submitted a proposal to the Department of Transportation, which includes mandatory bias training for all flight crew, ticket verification procedures before requesting any passenger to move, an in-flight real-time reporting system for discrimination, not after landing, not via customer service email, no more polite apologies that end with no accountability, no more quiet reassignments. We've come too far to keep pretending misunderstandings are harmless." She held a sheet of paper at the podium, but didn't read from it. She simply looked around. "Some will say I'm making too much of this, that it was just a flight, just a seat. But ask yourselves, how many times has this happened without a camera, without a title, without a name to protect the person it happened to? I don't want to become the exception that validates the rule. I want to help rewrite the rule." And then the applause came, not for a performance, but for a power that could not be denied. Evelyn stepped back from the podium, nodded once, and left the stage. She didn't wait for praise. Backstage, her assistant met her wide-eyed. "You didn't use the teleprompter." Evelyn smiled softly. "I didn't need to." A reporter approached gently, "Judge Monroe, may I quote you?" Evelyn tilted her head, then whispered, "I didn't come here to be quoted. I came here to be heard." That evening, her speech aired on every major television network. The clip circulated with headlines, "The woman who sat quietly in 2A is now making the whole country listen. The power of composure." She changed airline policy without raising her voice. But Evelyn didn't watch the broadcasts. She was reviewing policy draft revisions. She was working with legal advisors. She was responding to emails from federal offices and industry committees. In a small cafe in Memphis, a retired school teacher named Margaret Ellis watched the full speech on her phone. Tears slid quietly down her cheeks. That, she whispered, is what happens when someone doesn't just win justice, they become it. When a woman sat in silence aboard a plane, no one expected that silence would become the loudest sound of the day, and perhaps the clearest echo within a system long accustomed to its old ways. There were no raised voices, no fiery arguments, no angry demands, just a steady gaze, an upright posture. A woman who refused to disappear simply because others weren't used to seeing her in that seat. The story of Pacific Horizon. Flight 3117 wasn't just an isolated incident. It became a symbol of thousands of moments people have lived through when they were qualified, capable, and dignified, but still questioned, still excluded simply because of biases buried deep in society's subconscious. And then someone like Judge Miriam Cross stayed seated, not to reclaim a seat, but to declare something far greater. We deserve to be present, not through shouting, but through undeniable presence. She didn't wait for justice from someone else. She was justice. And her action, even in silence, sparked a much larger conversation about fairness, about how we see one another, and how sometimes change doesn't come from the loudest voice, but from the one who holds firm in silence. If this story made you feel something, a catch in your throat, a jolt of awareness, or even a small hope that the world can still be better, then share it. Somewhere, someone may need to feel seen. Click, like if you believe in change. Share, if you've ever stayed silent because you thought you had no voice. Subscribe to stay connected with stories that bring strength, compassion, and justice. Not through slogans, but through real people, real action, and real belief. Because sometimes, just one look from seat 2A is enough to make the world listen.